I'm joined today by Professor Salikoko Mufwene, the Frank J. McLaren Distinguished Service Professor of Linguistics at the University of Chicago. Sally, welcome.
Thank you.
And I understand there are some other affiliations you have. You can tell us a bit about that.
Well, I also have an appointment to the Committee on Evolutionary Biology because of my work on language evolution. And I have an appointment to the Committee on the Conceptual and Historical Studies of Science that has to do with the interdisciplinarity of my research. And I have an appointment to the Committee on African Studies, simply because I'm one of the few people at the University of Chicago who also study Africa. Yeah.
Thank you. And why I've invited you is your evolutionary approach to language. Could you give us a brief overview of that approach?
Yes, people often ask me why I don't just call my research historical linguistics. That's because I want to avoid the traps of traditional historical linguistics. I call it evolutionary linguistics because the way in which I approach the history of languages is patterned on evolutionary theory, in which it is assumed that the ecology rolls the dice on evolution. So things don't just happen out of context. They are conditioned by several ecological factors. And so that's one of the reasons. The other one is that if I say historical linguistics, people may think of things just in terms of A becomes B in the environment of C. I mostly deal with language speciation, to use a biological term. There's a fancy term for diversification. And like the emergence of Creoles is a case of language diversification, language speciation. And the emergence of varieties called indigenized Englishes is another case of that. And so these are things that I find easier to approach under the label of evolutionary linguistics than just historical linguistics. If I said genetic linguistics, but then people would focus only on diversification, the use of the comparative method, and not pay attention to structural changes that actually lead us to speciation. And another important aspect of that is that for the past 30 years or so, there has been a lot of concern with the vitality of languages under the label of language endangerment and loss. And that is in the proper domain of evolution.
Yes.
And it is particularly important because in the case of Creoles, where Creoles emerged, there were several languages that died.
Yes.
And we have to explain why this happened, under what particular conditions. But then we spread things and, develop a bigger picture. We will also notice that in places like the United States, it's not just the indigenous languages that died. There were a lot of colonial languages that are no longer spoken, like Italian, German, Danish, Dutch, and the like.
Yes.
And then you look at Louisiana, you see that French is still buying time, hanging in there. So how can you explain this? And how can you explain the fact that Dutch died sooner than German and those kinds of things? So in this particular case, you think of differences in the ecologies of these languages, and you try to come up with explanations.
Yes.
Yeah.
So something that, for example, in this view could happen is a species that is exogenous or foreign might enter a new environment and disrupt the ecology and adapt itself to that ecology.
Right. And the big challenge here is to describe what the ecology of language is. And the ecology of language turns out to be a quite complex package. Because the most direct ecology is none other than the speaker.
Yes.
But the speaker evolves in a socio-economic ecology. And so the speaker becomes the filter of a lot of pressures that are fundamentally economic, political, and in other social respects.
Yes.
And so, and then you can say, well, the economy, you just don't go and grow sugarcane anywhere. And you don't just go and grow coffee anywhere. So climatic considerations have to bear on the development of particular economic regimes, and the economic regimes lead to particular population structures, and the population structures influence the speakers that live in them.
Yes.
And speakers influence the vitality and the shapes of the language that they speak. Yeah.
Using English in South Africa as an example. So one could say that it used to be foreign. It has entered this ecology in South Africa.
Yes.
Obviously, colonialism has shifted the ecology drastically.
Yes.
Do you think one could say that English has become or is becoming indigenized or nativized?
I think English has indigenized everywhere in the world, although there is a political dimension in the way that the scholarship has been speaking of the indigenization of English, focusing especially on former exploitation colonies such as India, Nigeria, Ghana. But then you come to South Africa. South Africa is a special case where you have layers of colonization. So you have originally the Portuguese colonization that didn't last very long. That was a form of trade colonization. And then came the Dutch, and that was settlement colonization. And then came the English, and that was a layer of exploitation colonization, but mixed with settlement colonization. And so you have several things happening, one after the other. And ultimately, English as it is spoken in South Africa is the outcome of that layering of colonization. The other part of it is that it is debatable whether we should speak of South African English in the singular or whether we should speak of South African Englishes in the plural. But this is not a peculiarity of South Africa alone. If you live in the United States, the construct American English doesn't make much sense. It makes sense when you are outside the United States, but when you are within the United States, there are different varieties of American English. So it would also make sense to speak of American English, just as it would make sense to speak of British Englishes. But these are political constructs of convenience. And then somebody can also point out, wait a minute, when Americans travel abroad, despite internal differences, Americans sound more like each other than they are to British English speakers. And you can say the same thing too about South Africa. So it depends on the level of detail on which you want to focus.
I have to say I agree fully with that. It's South African English. It's matter of convenience to speak in the singular.
Right.
But I think that also it demonstrates very well how it is speaker dependent. Because, like you said earlier, the speaker is the filter, the speaker is the ultimate ecology.
Right.
And in South Africa, we have so many different speakers and people with different backgrounds.
That's right.
And I think that that's also an ultimate reason why it's better to speak of Englishes, not South African English,
Yes.
but the Englishes of the various speakers.
Right. And the history of English in South Africa over the past century is a very interesting one, because you have to deal with shifts of power from a polity that was strongly under the control of the British to a polity that became the hegemony of the Afrikaners. And then I don't know what I should call it, revolution of 1994, but you have a new regime that becomes more inclusive, and in which people of non-white descent are playing a more and more important role politically.
Yes.
Whereas when it comes to economy, there's a different story. But then this becomes an interesting history of access to the language. Who has access to English, and who gained access to English at what time, and who were the model speakers when they got access to English.
And I think that's an important, or to tie up to that, that's an important distinction to make here. When we speak about ecology, we do mean, or in the way that we're speaking about it now, we do mean who has access,
Right.
Who is involved, who participates.
Yes.
And I think that's just an important point to make for our viewers, just to understand what
right.
exactly we mean.
Yes. And also because South Africa is so multi-ethnic and multi-racial, you see, when did the Afrikaners really feel the pressure to learn English? And when they learn it, what usage did they make of it? When did South African Indians get access to English, and what did they use it for? And when did the educated blacks get access to English, and what are they using it for? And why is English becoming so pervasive in South Africa? But is it becoming pervasive for everybody? Is everybody under pressure to learn English? What about the Afrikaners in rural areas? Do they feel as much pressure to learn English as the Afrikaners in urban centers? The blacks in rural areas, do they feel as much need to learn English as the blacks in the urban centers? Well, is it everywhere in Cape Town that you really feel the pressure to learn English if you are black? Or is it only in some parts of Cape Town? Yeah.
Obviously, English is speciating.
Yeah.
That's the case here, as it is in many parts of the world. What do you think are some of the ecological factors that favor English being learned by certain people? As you mentioned now, certain people feeling a greater pressure to learn it, while others might feel no need.
Yeah. Well, it really depends on the especially formal economic sector in which an individual operates. If you are a blue-collar worker and it's enough for you to receive instructions for work in isiXhosa, there isn't as much pressure for you to learn English. But if you are a white collar worker, you probably feel a great deal of pressure not only to speak English, but to speak it the best way you can, because your promotion depends on that. And then you look at the bigger picture. Are the best paying jobs operating in English, in Afrikaans, in isiXhosa, in Zulu, or what?
Yeah.
And so if you are a parent and you are a blue-collar worker, but you don't want your child to have the same kind of life experience that you have had on the job market, what do? You encourage your child to go to an English-speaking school, and you do everything you can so that your child can receive good education in an English-speaking school.
Yeah.
And here we are dealing with what the language actually promises. We are not dealing with what the language actually makes available to you. That's another story, because when it comes to the job market, there are many other factors that come into play. But everybody recognizes that the possibility of making money is higher if you speak English than if you don't speak English.
Would you say economic factors, obviously with an ecological view of language,
Yeah.
All factors play some role at least. But would you say that economics play a bigger role than many other factors?
Yes. Economics actually drives many aspects of our lives. Okay, so if you put English on a worldwide scale and you look at a country such as China, why are the Chinese learning English? If it were a matter of demographics, we should all be learning Mandarin. But this is not what's happening, because China is becoming, or is already, a world power economically, and China needs to sell its products.
Yes.
On the world market, it's the buyer's language, it's not the manufacturer's language. And so China looks outside. Where is the biggest market? It's the United States, it's the British Commonwealth, and these territories are known as English-speaking. So China has a whole lot to gain in encouraging its citizens to learn English, because they are going to market the goods in English.
Yes.
Just the other side of it that we know little about is that China is also encouraging people to learn French, because there is a Francophone market, but the Francophone market is smaller. China is also encouraging its citizens to learn Spanish. The Spanish-speaking world is very big. In terms of native speakers, there are probably more native speakers of Spanish than there are native speakers of English. But the Spanish-speaking countries are poor.
Yes.
These are other factors that come into play in all this. So, yes, there you see the significance of economics. And then people want to travel for better opportunities elsewhere. And right now, science and technology are the most developed in English-speaking countries. And the people that are interested to participate in the domain of technology and science, they look forward to travel to English-speaking countries, or at least to read literature that comes from English-speaking countries. So there's that much pressure to learn English. So there's an intricate interplay of factors that wind up favoring English over other languages. Put it this way, If Americans too are interested in learning Mandarin because China is a big market and they want a share of it. But for every American learning Mandarin, there are probably 10 Chinese learning English. And so in the end, the larger population of China winds up favoring the spread of English more than the American population is helping spread Chinese or Mandarin around the world.
I think that's a perfect example of the ecological pressures that function. But also, while you've been speaking about, well, I guess one could call it globalization.
Yes.
Everyone has pressure with the expanding circle, to use Kashru's terminology. But I think in South Africa there is a very intricate balance between the internal pressures that we have from having been colonized, having been inseminated with English, and then from the outside we still also have those pressures like China does, to want to participate in a global market.
Yes.
And I think that creates a very interesting ecological setup in South Africa specifically.
That's right. And so what you have to look into in the case of South Africa is the fact that globalization can be interpreted in a number of ways. So you have actually, if I understood you well, referred to globalization as a worldwide network of interdependencies and interconnectedness.
Yes.
But there's another sense of globalization that is within South Africa itself, the extent to which the different sectors of the economy are interconnected.
Yes.
So you have the electricity, you have transportation, you have the different manufacturing parts of the South African industry. And in this kind of situation, the different sectors of the economy have to come to a common language. And then you have competition between Afrikaans and English. So which one is going to prevail? Afrikaans gives you a smaller market. English gives you a wider market. And English is more likely to bring more investments into South Africa than Afrikaans is. And so you see the intricacy of factors that are competing with each other, which wind up favoring English over Afrikaans. Now you look at the economic power of Zulu, Xhosa. You know, what do they have to contribute economically? And that disadvantages the Bantu languages to start with. And there's one that a group that we seldom mention, the Khoi languages. People seldom speak of them. Why are they so marginalized? Because the contribution to the formal economy is not really taken into account. So in the end, everything boils down to the economy. So even in the context of globalization, my hypothesis is the more strongly a country is globalized economically, the greater role it plays in the worldwide scale of globalization. So you find places like Singapore, very small, but very strong on the scale of internal economic globalization, and it plays a very important role proportional to its size in the worldwide economy, a globalized economy. Yeah.
I think a lot of what we're speaking about shows the importance of economic development of people. But I think a specific thing that's worth mentioning is, or worth asking, do you see a place for English not as the dominator, as the colonizer, as the master, but where it just is, it has its functions in South Africa as a case study, and where the other languages, such as Xhosa, such as Zulu, such as Tswana, or the Khoisan languages, can still coexist with it without being outcompeted, if I can use that word?
Well, it depends very much on how the economy develops. If the economy, if the formal economy especially, grows to where it becomes absolutely necessary for a person to know English in order to operate in the economic system. But it also grows in such a way that there are more jobs that are being created, and people can find rewards in investing in English. It can destabilize the other languages. But if the economy evolves in such a way that the other languages are also economically empowered, and there are sectors of the economy that work in these regional and more indigenous languages, then English is not going to be a threat to those languages. English has displaced so many languages in the United States and Australia because there is a kind of economy that at every level functions in one dominant language. And so everybody feels the pressure to develop competence in that language. It doesn't matter what kind of competence. It doesn't have to be in standard English, but you develop competence in this English. In the end, the other languages become redundant. If you don't really need to speak two languages, you can stick to one. But in places like South Africa, like the rest of Africa, where it is still necessary for many people to speak more than one language, then English is not as much of a threat as people make lead you to believe. Yeah.
I especially like that last part, the way you say it's not as much of a threat as people may think.
Yeah.
Because, well, if we regard English as an indigenized language, I think it would be, the ideal is if it can exist alongside the other languages rather than it superseding them or displacing them.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the reasons actually you'll find it in family structures. So if in your family you have become economically affluent and you have received more formal education than other members of your family, that does not mean that you disavow the rest of your family. You wind up straddling between two worlds, the world of the economically affluent and the world of the economically disenfranchised. And you need that kind of straddling. You don't give up on your cultural heritage. So it's like you changing attires. There's one attire for the job, and there's another kind of attire for socialization. There's one language for your economic activities, and there is another language for your social activities and so forth. And you still participate in heritage ceremonies, and you are going to speak that particular language. And I'm sure this applies as much to I don't know what I should say, Bantu people as it applies to the Afrikaners, that you find it useful to speak more than one language and you adapt to the situations. Yes. Yesterday, actually, I was speaking to an Afrikaner who said, "Oh, yes, my father spoke 5 languages." And then my immediate question was your father a farmer? And she said, yes.
Okay.
And so the father learned English, and was born African speaker, but also because on the farm, the father had to work with helpers that spoke all these other languages, and the father found it very useful to know these languages. And my reaction was, of course, it's a mechanism of survival. You wouldn't like to be surrounded by people that speak things in languages that you don't understand.
Exactly.
But the other side of it is that you might find it more effective to convey instructions in the languages that your helpers speak better.
Exactly.
That way there is less loss in time, in efficiency. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning for anyone viewing. We have used the word Bantu, which I just want to give a disclaimer. It has a bad political history in South Africa.
And I apologize for that.
Linguistically, the use differs from. I'm not trying to berate you. It's just in case someone doesn't have the context. But I want to link up to something you just mentioned, where there's the affluence and the less, where maybe you're from a less affluent background and you become affluent.
Yes.
And you have that struggle between the two identities. I think that's a brilliant example of a different ecology within an individual. Different ecologies competing. And I think in South Africa very often, we have so much diversity. You almost can't be just the one thing. You have to be the difference, contain those different ecologies. And I think often that leads to a more rounded person or a more rounded identity.
Yeah.
Do you find that is the case?
Yeah, you shouldn't put it in terms of, shouldn't say should. You need not put it in terms of struggle. It's just that you are in a situation where it is necessary to have multiple identities. Because after all, you are not going to interact with everybody in the same space and at the same time. And you navigate your universe being in one place at one time and at another place at another time, interacting with one group of people on one occasion and a different group of people on another occasion. It's more or less like traveling too. When you travel, if you really have the time and money, you would invest in the language and customs of the places that you visit so that you can fit in them. And so that's what people do. But it is not practical for everybody to learn all the languages. It's a matter of practicality and convenience. And I think that one of the reasons why English is spreading so fast is that for many people from different backgrounds, English becomes that common denominator, and they can all resort to it. That kind of kills the motivation for Zulu speakers to learn Xhosa and vice versa. If you are educated, if you are highly schooled. However, if you were neighbors, the pressure wouldn't really be resolved necessarily that way, because there are matters that you can handle better if you just made an effort to speak the other indigenous language, even if you don't speak it fluently.
Yes.
Just the symbolism of wanting to speak the other's language puts you both in more favorable attitudes of interaction toward each other, rather than when you use this neutral language that in some ways you may not consider part of your cultural heritages. Yeah.
Yes, and I think on a more confined level, a more constricted level, if you approach each other through your different kinds of English, let's say so-called native and non-native English,
Right.
for example,
Yes.
a similar thing can be achieved.
Yes and no. If two people come in contact with each other, and one is a native speaker and the other one is not a native speaker, and there are differences in levels of fluency, there can be a kind of hegemonic relation between the two, and one may be less comfortable than the other. Yeah, but it could also be that the other person just appreciates, the native speaker appreciates the fact that you have made such an effort to learn the language, and that alone puts you in a favorable position. But it also depends on where you meet. If the native speaker and the non-native speaker meet in a world that is native to neither,
Yes.
that creates a bond. If the native speaker meets the non-native speaker in the non-native speaker's home, that's a different kind of thing.
Yes.
The power relation shouldn't really come to play, otherwise the native speaker doesn't get what they want. And if the native speaker meets the non-native speaker in the native speaker's home, then the native speaker may develop an attitude of arrogance.
Yes.
So these things happen. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all about the individual, and
Yes.
I think that also goes back to your earlier remark about the speaker being the filter, the speaker being the locus, if I can call it that,
Right.
of the ecology.
Yes, and also thank you for making that comment. When we speak of language contact, we tend to think in terms of populations. So this population came in contact with that other population, and the two populations spoke two different languages, and this is what is going to happen. But in reality, it's individuals that come in contact with each other, and the kinds of changes that we are concerned with in the histories of languages are convergences in the ways that individuals behave, how they tackle different situations. If they develop similar strategies, then we can see one particular direction of change that is happening. But it could also be a situation of bifurcated change, where one segment of the population does one thing and another segment of the population does a different thing. And precisely what we see here in South Africa too.
I was just about to say it's not even bifurcated. It's just so multifaceted.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. But then you tend to find patterns, and then we, because we want to simplify things when we explain them, we ascribe people to particular groups. So this group does this group does that, and so forth. Still, we should remember that within those groups, it's a matter of convergence in the particular ways in which people resolve their challenges, their communication challenges.
I think something which I'm personally very interested in is, I think, the revisionist approach to Creole languages to language
Yes.
variation in general.
Right.
So this is on a broader topic.
Yes.
Do you think there's room for the revision of the way that we've been approaching languages, especially as you've been saying, we're looking at populations instead of individuals?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, Creoles, people didn't, like the Africans on plantations on the New World, didn't have meetings every evening about how they are going to, adapt to the new situation, and how they have to speak the colonial master's language. Everybody is adapting in whichever way possible and learning the language and so forth. And what happens is that in every population, we don't just learn things from the target population, we also learn things from each other. You have learned a particular expression earlier than me, and then I learn it from you, and I have learned a particular uh, vocabulary item before you, and you learn it from me. And between two kinds of pronunciations, mine is less successful than yours, then I start targeting yours. And these are mutual accommodations that wind up generating a new language variety. But the question is whether what happened in the case of Creoles is different from what happened in the case of the so-called indigenized Englishes. But even if you took non-indigenized Englishes, the so-called native Englishes, such as American English, is it really a different kind of story? And my hunch is that because I have worked on Creoles are prompting me loud and clear to re-examine the case of other languages, and that maybe Creoles are really telling us how languages actually change under the pressure, under particular ecological pressures. Okay, and the difference between the people that have to give up, to shift from the heritage languages more or less abruptly because they don't find anybody else to speak the heritage language with, versus people that shift languages gradually because they don't use the new language in every situation. They are under no pressure to operate in all domains of life in that new language, and they do it in a different way. Yes. But then, in the big picture, when you look at the history of the United States, for instance, there was a time when people spoke of Italian English, of German English. They must have spoken of Dutch English too, but Yiddish English. But these varieties, they are almost all gone. And the question we should be asking, why is there still an African American English? And why is there a Namish English? And then we are learning about population structure, how segregation and assimilation or social integration work. And where segregation is maintained, the differences are maintained, and where segregation has been removed, and then one particular variety disappears. Okay, so we can see to what extent what we are learning actually is that even the white population in the United States had not always been integrated. This is something that evolved gradually, and with that gradual integration came the disappearance of Italian English, of German English, of Yiddish English. And so what we are finding now is the African American population isn't integrated yet. The Amish population is not integrated yet. The reasons for not being integrated are different. For instance, for the Amish, it could be their own choice. But for the African Americans, is it really their own choice? So these are the kinds of things that we have to look into. And I can add something else that gives us also a different idea about how to deal with language endangerment. People are speaking of the loss of indigenous languages. In the bigger picture, which are the languages that died first? The competing European colonial languages or the Native American languages? Why are we talking so much about Native American languages being endangered? Because that is so obvious now. But why is it so obvious? Because the competing European languages have died already in these particular colonies. And the reason for this differential evolution seems to lie in how the new socio-economic world order evolved, integrating Europeans first and leaving everybody else out on the margins.
Yes.
That includes Native Americans. But it also gives us another idea, the fact that the Africans in this scenario didn't have a choice about maintaining their languages because they were introduced into the new socio-economic world order as kinds of instruments that had to work for the economy in deplorable conditions.
Yes.
And they didn't have a choice about maintaining their languages. It tells us something about the white indentured servants that were in similar situations, that didn't have the luxury of maintaining their languages either. The Africans and the indentured servants were among the first people to anglicize. And then came the free European immigrants, mostly after the American Revolution. And now Native Americans cannot remain on the reservations anymore because the reservations are not economically sustainable. Yes. And they have to come and join the American mainstream population and the dominant socioeconomic structure, and that dominant socioeconomic structure doesn't give them a choice. Okay? Now, when you put that in the context of South Africa, for instance, the time during which the Afrikaners ruled South Africa, it put Afrikaans in a hegemonic position. And what happened? Every white that wanted to stay in South Africa, they didn't have to give up their heritage language, but they had to learn Afrikaans too.
Yes.
So a lot of whites in South Africa became bilingual in English and Afrikaans. Okay. And then different dynamics will bring resistance to Afrikaans when Afrikaans was considered as a language of oppression. And that is how it applies to the blacks in particular. So you see the advantage of approaching things ecologically. You don't deal just with the changes. You have to also deal with what technically we call actuators of change, the things that trigger the changes. And these things, you find them in the ecology.
Just to tie up with something that you mentioned earlier about how much we can learn about language and the way that it changes from what we've traditionally called Creoles.
Yes.
I think it really demonstrates how the types of language that we've often excluded economically, politically, how much value there is and how much there is to learn from those formerly excluded types of language.
Right.
So that's just an observation. And also you...
But that is also important because traditionally Creoles were treated as bastard languages because apparently they emerged from language mixing. But then in the end you ask which new language variety has not emerged from language mixing?
Exactly.
And why would just one group be called bastard languages and not the other group? The term that I used in my work was children out of wedlock. Because in genetic linguistics, you have this uniparental model of the Stammbaum, the cladogram, or the language tree. And it's just, the branches taking different directions, and they are not supposed to crisscross. But that's not reality. The reality is that languages came in contact with each other, and out of those contacts, new language varieties emerged. Yeah.
Yes. And I also wanted to pick up you mentioned accommodation.
Yes.
Which I think, especially, well, if we go back to the individual, I find it's a very striking concept. Constantly, we are in contact with each other. Constantly,
right.
Linguistic contact is happening.
Yes.
And we need to accommodate.
That's right.
Could you expand a bit on your conception of accommodation?
Yeah, so Michel Brial, a French linguist in the early 20th century, said each individual speaks their own language. And this is what we have constructed in modern linguistics as idiolect.
Yes.
And so the real contact is really at the level of idiolects. If you think that you speak the same language, your idiolects are negotiating features with each other. And the more you interact with each other, the more similar your idiolects become. The less you interact with each other, the more likely your idiolects should be more distinct. Now, if instead of idiolects you have different languages, it's going to be more or less the same thing. Either one of you gives up the other language, or when you interact with each other, you mix up features from different languages. And what usually happens, even when one person gives up their language, they don't give up everything. They maintain some features of their language, and between the two individuals interacting with each other, something new is happening that outsiders may notice. Yeah. The person whose language prevails will be using some features of the person who gave up their language. Yeah.
And that's what's been happening in South Africa too. Even in that hegemony of English.
Yes.
There are certain features that creep into it.
That's right.
From the other languages.
Yes. Yes. I don't quite like the term creep, but that's
all right.
it reflects that hegemonic relation between languages. Yes.
Yes. Well,
but it gets the picture.
They get transferred.
Yes.
You prefer that, so
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I prefer the term feature pool, where there is competition among variants, and so some variants get selected over others for reasons that we do not always understand. Some reasons we know, and others we don't know. Yeah.
Yes, the feature pool is, I think, one of the primary concepts that your theory is based on, or a lot of your ideas, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. Yeah. Because in my 2001 book, I presented the feature pool as an arena of competition. And maybe I made the mistake of focusing too much on competition. There is also coexistence, because we live in a world of variation, and variation usually what survives, but the forms of variation change. But you're always going to find variance, yes. And what makes things particularly interesting is when either some variants disappear or new variants find their way in. Yeah.
Yes. I actually really like that comment from you just now.
Yeah.
Because I think the ideal is in a more ideological sense.
Yes.
To have coexistence between the various languages rather than one outcompeting the others and them being lost.
Right.
Because I think it's a point that doesn't need to be made, but languages are living examples of human heritage.
Yes, precisely.
Because they have been living with us and they have been going through all these ecological processes that we've been discussing.
Right.
And they do reflect those individual idiolects.
Yeah. And so if you really wanted to get into details, you have to remember that languages themselves are constructs of convenience. Because for us, the main thing is communication.
Yes.
And we use different features to communicate.
Yes.
And so it's at the level of our academic theorizing that we come up with constructs such as language in order to explain things, and we allocate the features to languages. It's more or less like allocating individuals to different countries and accounting for certain things that happen in terms of how these countries interact with each other.
Sally, thank you very much for joining me today.
I thank you for inviting me to talk to you.
It's been a lively discussion, and I hope our viewers also enjoyed it.
Okay.
Thank you once again.
Thank you.